Dan and Mick put up a really interesting video yesterday on that pedal show around what they're calling the best amp in the world, the Fender Deluxe Reverb. Now, I actually kind of discovered this about 2-3 weeks ago. My buddy Jake Loosemore lent me this Deluxe Reverb that we basically found one that came up used for £850. We bought it used, but amps are dead, and the reason is actually kind of hidden within that pedal show, and I kind of wanted to discuss that. Actually, if you talk to people that work in shops, like music shops and stuff like that, amps supposedly just don't really sell anymore.
This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
When you hear Mick talking about kind of the advent of the silent stage, which I think has even ramped up further since kind of lockdown, I think we can talk about some things which probably we could change, some things that maybe might work, and what the actual state of play is if you want to be a working guitarist. And this is the key here, that people that are gigging as professionals want to keep their jobs, and I think there is a reality at play here where actually the guitar isn't quite as important as many of us would like to think it is. This is coming from a guy who obviously spends all day playing in my bedroom, but at the weekends, you know, I've done a bunch of gigs, probably like many of you guys, and many of you guys that have gone between amps and modelers and stuff like that and had to kind of be pragmatic about it and make that switch. I think the reality is, for most people doing this, it is, if you want to get lots of gigs, probably you're going to have to encounter situations where using some sort of digital modeler might be a reality, or playing quieter is also a reality. I guess I wanted to just explore why it is that the idea of the silent stage has become a thing. So in the UK, there's lots of venues that are kind of in potentially barns or part of listed houses, maybe near other residential areas which are kind of posh. These have started doing weddings for whatever reason, to generate money for the estate essentially, and oftentimes as part of their license they might have to keep volume levels quite a lot lower than you might expect, and
sort of 85, 90 dB, 95 is not that uncommon. Now, I guess you could say, well, I don't want to play those venues, I'll just do something else. So if you don't get onto the wedding and function scene, then the best money that you really get is generally in pubs and bars in the UK. And weddings and functions pay about twice the money, at least, that a bar or, you know, pub gig tends to pay. But if you're wanting gigs where, you know, you can use an amp, a pub or a bar is probably the ideal spot to still use them. So we've got a venue around here that Mick and Jake and me play. It's called the Firehouse. In Frome, there's a place where they do gigs with Dan Bingham and Scott McKeon. But pubs and bar gigs are actually still pretty decent clubs for using a real amp. It's mostly kind of, I think, churches and the function / wedding scene where there is more of a push towards the silent stage, and that has crept as well, because it's oftentimes, you know, people that are working within the wedding and function scene also then are also doing kind of this touring stuff as well, and like there's also convenience factors that come in there. So that's kind of where the silent stage stuff, I think, has come from.
One of the things that Mick was talking about was kind of using a deluxe reverb on 9 and turning the volume back on the guitar, and the decibel meter was kind of tickling around 100 dB for much of that, 100 dB, 103. Not as loud as it was getting in the Robin Ford episode, but around us and in the professional kind of function wedding scene, there's a lot of limiters that would definitely not allow you to be getting anywhere near that volume. And remembering as well that guitar is just one part of the band, I think that's a thing that we also need to bear in mind. So if you're shooting for a volume around 90 dB, 95, 100, then you have to bear in mind that the drummer is also going to be playing at a certain volume, the bass, and if you start to play together, that's going to chuck out an average volume, which is of course the accumulation of all of the elements of the band. So this is one thing that I think we need to really talk about more, is that drummers don't necessarily play particularly quietly ever. And this was another thing that he mentioned in this episode, where Dan was talking about if you've got a drummer on stage, then there's no real reason that you couldn't have an amp. And there is some element of truth to that, although sound men will be, sound ladies maybe even as well, sound people will be pretty aggressive with you these days if you try and compete with the volume of a drummer. It's what I've found, it's my experience. Let me know if that's yours as well. But I think they were kind of tickling the deluxe reverb kind of at a bass level on like 4 on the volume knob. My buddy Jake, who gigs the deluxe reverb, if you're lucky you might get away with 3, but with the sound guy that sometimes works with that band, taking it down to 2.5 is a bit closer to reality. 2 is like a healthy-ish bedroom volume, and actually the deluxe reverb is pretty magical even on 2, I found. So in that pedal show episode, they were kind of finding a big difference when they turned it up to 4, but I managed to get it to feed back with a Zendrive and do this beautiful kind of singing thing, with the volume just kind of tickling to just over 2. So I think there are great things that can happen even with a tube amp at a reasonable lowish volume even. So that's kind of one positive for amps, right? The other thing is, I've been on some gigs, you know, and most gigs in terms of function bands these days tend to be using in-ear monitors, in which case the kind of amp on stage volume does start to feel a bit redundant, especially in cases where a bass player doesn't show up with an amp. Now, I'm all in favour of bringing a bass amp. In fact, last weekend I actually brought a bass amp so that the bass player that was playing in the band would have a bass amp on stage. And that enabled me really to bring my own amp. Without a bass amp though, if you have a guitar amp, it can get a little bit weird I know drummers who much prefer playing with both a bass amp and a guitar amp so that they can actually hear what's going on stage. Again, sound people seem to absolutely love it when everything is going direct, so they can get more control over stuff. And I think it's probably an inferior experience in many cases for the guitarist, but possibly the rest of the band might even prefer it. Maybe. One other thing that Mick did say was that during sound check, where the sound guy is listening and taking levels, he said don't give him your loudest sound. Now, I've also done this before. I think if you've got a mic on the amplifier, this is a little bit risky and maybe a little bit naughty. But so on my modeler, for instance, I might go between clean and like a rhythm, so that he's at least got those two. And then my lead tone is a couple of dB louder than both of those, because normally I'll be playing in a band with a keyboard player and stuff like that. It's just required that if you're going to take a solo, it jumps up in volume. If you do that with a sound man with a real amp, there's a chance potentially that if you don't give him that loudest sound, when you eventually do that on a gig, it's just going to take you down out of the mix in general anyway. Or you're going to clip the microphone, which presumably out of front of house, if he's got you going through the front of house, it's going to sound a little bit dodgy as well. So there's a couple of things to think about there as well. Worth mentioning is, like, in a scenario where you've got, say, two guitars, like, what happens then if, you know, both guitarists are thinking, right, I need to be at kind of 4 in my sweet spot to be able to kind of get the amp cooking, and then the other guitarist is doing the same, and then because the volume has crept up, I think a big part with you know, the sound of a guitar and that is kind of levels relative to what else is going on. I've noticed in videos of gigs where I've really thought the guitar tone was cooking, it might have been way louder than other gigs where I felt like the guitar tone kind of sucked, even though, you know, there might have been actually the same tone, it's just that relative volume compared to how loud the drummer is playing and that sort of stuff. So in that scenario, you know, where this other guitarist might be, you know, cooking volumes up pretty high, you get this kind of scenario where you just got like a battle of volumes. The drummers, of course, always going to be heard because they're always loud, and I think that's another element that we don't talk about enough, is that guitarists are expected to be, you know, able to come down in volume. Drummers are actually pretty stubborn with this, and to the point where trying to get drummers to play with rods and stuff like that can be really tough. You know, even in venues where they've got like an aggressive limiter, drummers I play with always prefer to play with actual sticks. And in terms of actually regulating volume, I think drummers could do with maybe some more attention on that. I can find videos online about how to play drums louder with more effort, and people talking about playing at the top of your dynamic range. I think there's less focus in drumming about actually playing at a level which is appropriate for the venue, but that could be a thing for a drum channel to talk about probably. The thing is that as the levels of guitar kind of creep up, then the levels at front of house creep up, and then necessarily the vocal mics kind of have to creep up. And as someone who does sound for my own band, I have to be a bit careful with that, because it means that as things go up, likelihood of feedback from microphones gets way higher, and that's kind of what I guess most sound people have to deal with. So I can see that if you've just got a really stubborn guitarist who's going to say, well, this guitar has to be at this volume for me to get it to sound right, that's going to be pretty tricky and cause a bit of friction. Potentially something like a Perspex shield in that scenario might be a better idea if you're someone who really wants to get your tube amps cooking. One thing that I don't think we discuss enough, and this is something that you'd think might get brought into the discussion more often, is Joe Bonamassa's kind of thing with the clear shields. I'm going to put a link in the description here, because Joe Bonamassa obviously plays with an incredible amount of stage volume, given that he has, you know, all of those amps. But I remember even back in like 2015, Paddy, who plays bass for that pedal show, used to play guitar, and I can remember seeing him playing in a pub with a divided by 13 FTR 37 that used to belong to Ben Jones, who plays Jacob Collier now. And even back then, Paddy, you know, had this kind of idea of the sweet spot on the amp, but because he felt like that was too much stage volume, he would use one of those Perspex shields, and of course in churches around the world you're kind of used to seeing drummers using those. I think maybe guitarists should consider that as a thing, particularly, I don't know, I'm certainly someone who loves a bit of stage volume, but in a situation maybe where you've got a limiter or a particularly aggressive sound person, maybe that could solve some issues. I don't think we talk about those too much. I was surprised not to see a fry-out load box or that sort of thing get mentioned, because some sort of attenuator on a non-master volume amp might not be a bad idea, probably. And I'm pretty sure there are definitely people out there gigging the fry-out stuff in particular, and the aux box as well. I think people enjoy those, because I've certainly noticed that I tend to like quite a bit of volume. Depending on where you're standing, it can sound, you know, like, am I even really on? I think like an amp stand, I did buy one and then it was locked down, so I never really used it. But that might not be a bad idea either. So if the amp is actually pointed towards you, or, you know, you've got a Fender with the amp stand things, that might not be a bad idea particularly. But I think the best bet would be, as a guitarist, to get used to playing silent stages, get used to being able to sometimes actually crank an amplifier and have a lot more fun. It's definitely way more fun. But I think if you want to be a working guitarist, and if it was a guy that was like asking me, that was, you know, trying to do gigs and get on tours and stuff like that, I think these days you probably do need to be comfortable with the idea of doing both. And more likely, I think you might find that if you're on in-ears and touring around the world, they're going to prefer you to be using a modeler. And if you're someone who's going to be absolutely adamant that you're going to have to play it volume 4 on a Deluxe Reverb, I think you might find that you might not see as many opportunities as the guy who's going to be a bit more flexible. It's just the impression that I get. I think that's something worth bearing in mind, that if you want the gig, you probably need to be able to adapt to various bits and pieces. I saw the Dead and Company were playing at the Sphere, and the Sphere has kind of got this reputation now, although there's only been a couple of bands play there, that you won't ever be seeing an amp being played live on stage or that sort of thing. It's kind of actually not true, because I've seen Mayers actually using amps on stage as it is. But to get this to work, even John Mayer, you know, obviously one of the biggest guitarists there is, had basically an isolation box kind of by the doors to load into the Sphere, and they were all down there in a box, the cabs, and they ran huge speaker cables down off stage onto those. So, you know, even in the case like someone like John Mayer is not in a scenario where he's able to do what he wants every single time. Yeah, I think even that Joe Bonamassa thing, where even on his own gigs he's using Perspex, I think it shows a level of, you know, what does it actually take to do this job, and adapting to a scenario, and not just thinking, well, it needs to be, you know, all these amps on 10 or else I just can't do the gig. Trying to adapt to these things, I think, is an important part of being a working guitarist in these days as well. Like John Mayer played with an FM9 with Ed Sheeran. You know, you've seen him play as well. I think there was a hip hop gig where he used an Axe FX. I think, yeah, even John Mayer is, you know, not totally set against using digital gear for the job when it is appropriate. Thank you to That Pedal Show for all of the amazing stuff that they've shared with us over the years. I got loads out of that show, and it's just amazing fun. They also said that they don't have a Pro Reverb in the comments, so if they ever want this Pro Reverb, I've said to Jake he should take that one, and it could live there if they want to have a go on that bad boy. But yeah, I still get to use amps live occasionally. I think you need to be sensitive with volume these days if you're going to keep gigs.